Hello readers, I'm Amy. Welcome to is it the 7th or the 8th night of the 13 Nights of Halloween, where I do some spooktacular videos on books and Halloween stuff and recommendations, and it's going to be awesome. Please like this video and leave a comment down below if you're watching it. Just let me know that you're here, that you're seeing this. Today, we are going to do books about writers, because I've found that it's kind of a subgenre of horror that really, really works for me. I believe the first book that I read about a author that was a horror book was Stephen King's Misery. This was a really great one to start with. I think you have this guy, he's driving through the snow or something, has trouble with his truck, kind of passes out, and this woman comes to help him, and turns out she's a really big fan of his writing. She doesn't like that the series that he's writing is going to end. She's trying to force him to write it. It's this horrible stuff that happens as he is kidnapped and kept in this woman's house. I remember the movie also being super entertaining. This is, as far as I know, the most popular book, the most well-read or widely read book about a writer being trapped someplace or going through horrible things. And yeah, recommend to kind of get started with this subgenre. After that, I believe the next book that I read about a writer in the horror genre was Kill Creek. This one I have on audiobook on my phone. I've read it twice and really enjoyed it. It's got a bit of a slower start. It's more of a slow burn book. But not only is Kill Creek about writers, but it's also one of the first books that I read about haunted houses that I really loved. So if you know me, I've discussed it before. Haunted houses took me a little bit to get into. I had to find what did and didn't work for me in haunted houses, and I found that psychologically haunted houses make for good movies, but the books I'm just not interested in. And physically haunted houses, I can't do the movies, it's too much for me, but a physically haunted house book is my sweet spot. Love it. So Kill Creek is more of a physically haunted house. It's not like House on Haunted Hill, where it's more of a psychological thing, as an example. But Kill Creek is following this guy who is an author. He's also teaching a college course on writing, and one of his friends, or maybe his agent or someone, meets up with him, and he's like, hey, you got this offer to be on a TV show. So this guy is trying to make sort of a documentary. He does it every year around Halloween, where this year he's going to be following authors in a haunted house. So he has this haunted house picked out. He picks out this guy who teaches the writing courses, as well as some other authors, which one of the authors that's supposed to be in the documentary is very clearly a fictional take on Stephen King, which I really loved. And then you have a woman author who's really like an extreme horror writer, and you can tell that her extreme horror writing is kind of a way for her to process stuff that's happened in her life. And you're following all of these authors as they visit this haunted house, and doesn't seem like anything odd is really going on, but then they leave the haunted house and their writing has some patterns that start to appear, and they have to determine, are we going to get back together and take another look at this house? Like, what's going on? Why are these patterns here? Really loved it. If you want more of a slow burn horror and you want to explore books on authors, I think that this is also a really great one to go with, and the audiobook is really solid. Next up, this is a book that I don't recommend very much because I struggle a bit with the content, and it's from one of my favorite authors. So I have here the advanced reader copy that I got from the author, Number One Fan by Meg Ellison. This came out over a year ago, I believe, and I did see on her Instagram that she just finished writing her next one, and I'm super excited for it. This I have complicated feelings on this book. Meg Ellison wrote the Book of the Unnamed Midwife trilogy, which I have talked on and on about, and I have a standalone review for it. I really loved it. She did Find Layla, which is a young adult book about a girl in a less than ideal living situation. Really excellent. Then Number One Fan. Content-wise, it is my least favorite of her books because it really made me uncomfortable, which is not a bad thing. That's a very good thing to say for this kind of book. But it's just a little bit out of my comfort zone, personally, which makes it my least favorite of her books. However, I do think that each book she writes, she's clearly, like, advancing in her writing, becoming a better and better storyteller, as you would hope to happen as you keep writing. So, writing-wise, it's her best one. It's her newest. But Number One Fan is following a woman who ends up getting kidnapped by someone who says that he is her number one fan. And a lot of the uncomfortable aspects are because it is so realistic, because you're following kind of how this guy started to notice her and how he learned her schedule and how the kidnapping ended up being able to take place. And it's so creepy. I don't know what kind of research Meg Ellison was doing to write this, but it's so creepy and it feels so real how he's stalking her social media. He sees her at these different writing conferences and notices her personality and her patterns. He gets to know her agent and her way of life, who does and doesn't know where she is at any point of time, and it's so creepy. But big trigger warning towards the end of this book for medical trauma. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't like talking about it, but I will say it is gynecological medical trauma, which is the kind of medical trauma that I really am uncomfortable reading about. It makes me feel physical pain thinking about gynecological medical trauma, so if you can't handle that, don't read this book. Or if you would like me to tell you more about it so you know before you read it, I am absolutely fine. If you want to leave a comment down below, ask what the trigger trauma thing is, I will answer your comment. I don't want to talk about it in a video. It's gonna make me super uncomfortable. But if you are okay with something that's a little more on the extreme side, if you like books about stalkers and also want to read a book about an author, this would be a great one. I feel like it's almost, I don't want to say another version of Misery from Stephen King, but that's the book that I would most compare it to, because you have a writer who is kidnapped by a fan and goes through these awful things. But this book made me more uncomfortable than Misery did. And I think a lot of that is because this is a female author, so I can kind of relate more to the character. Female author of the book, as well as we're following a female author. Because as a woman, I do get really uncomfortable depending on who's surrounding me. If a man has been walking behind me for more than a block, I get really uncomfortable. I'm hyper aware because as a woman, you have to be hyper aware of these things. It's just unfortunately how life is. So this book makes me a lot more uncomfortable than Misery does. But if that sounds like something that's interesting to you, definitely pick this up. I did enjoy this book, like I enjoyed the writing and the storytelling, but I'm not going to read it again because it makes me uncomfortable. But also, Meg Ellison is one of my favorite authors, so I have to talk about her. Then, next up, I have The Writing Retreat. I read this recently. It's taking place a little more in winter, so I wish I could have read it in winter, but it was late summer. I was really excited to read this. I didn't want to wait. So the physical weather of outdoors, where I like to read on my bench, took me out of it a little bit. But regardless, I did really enjoy this book. This book, again, we're following authors. There is this author who had a falling out with her best friend over an event that happened a year ago, I believe, and we do eventually find out what that event was through little bits and pieces throughout the story. But this author and this old friend, now enemy of hers, end up getting invited to the house of this really famous writer to take part in a writing retreat. So they're going to spend a month there living at her house, working on writing workshops and stuff. There's a bunch of other people who are also accepted into this house, so it's like a group trip. But things start to get a little weird. The writing workshop is a lot more intense than anyone thought that it was going to be, and the author whose house it is not a great person. People are immediately put off by her. They're never sure if she's being serious or if she's joking. She seems really harsh on everything. She's very, very strict about the writing schedules, and things go downhill from there. I've heard mixed reviews on this book. Personally, I really, really enjoyed it. I think it's a great, fast-paced kind of thriller read that you don't have to take too seriously. I liked the ending of it and where it went. I liked the exploration of the relationships between women. I will say that a lot of criticism I see with writing women characters is that a lot of people feel like women have to be enemies of other women. They're constantly competing. And this book definitely plays into that trope where these women are pitted against each other. You can tell that it's very much like the situation that they're in is pitting them against each other, but I will say if you're not kind of into that trope, maybe don't pick up this book, but I did really enjoy it. Also, every time I look at this cover, this neon writing on this black and white background gets me every time. Last horror-related book I'm going to talk about. I didn't actually finish this book, but I do want to talk about a story in the book. Don't want to flash you. I watched the Black Phone movie. When did that come out? Early this year? And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've only read one Joe Hill before. That was Nosferatu. The story was good. I thought it was too long. But Black Phone was a really excellent movie, and I wanted to try reading the book, and I didn't realize, for one thing, it was actually called 20th Century Ghosts. I think they renamed it Black Phone because of the movie, and I didn't realize that it was an anthology. I don't know how many stories are in here. Like I said, I DNF'd it. I was buddy reading this with friends. I got 3 stories in, and I didn't want to do it anymore. I really enjoyed the first story, and the other 2... I just didn't get it. I didn't think they were interesting. I didn't think they were thought-provoking. But regardless, we are talking about writers in horror, and the first story in this was from a perspective that I haven't read before, and that is a horror writing editor. So we're following the editor of a magazine. He's been there for like 20 years, and he's talking about how it gets really exhausting to try and pick out great horror stories for this magazine because no one can surprise him anymore. He's read it all, he's seen it all, nothing is new anymore, he's kind of tired of it, and then he comes across this story that really gets him. It's not the best written, it's not the most exciting, but something about the story just gets him, and he has to know who the author is so he can get the permissions to put it in the magazine. But when he contacts the person who sent him the story, he finds that he can't find the author. Where is this author? What is this guy doing? He wants to get a hold of him so he can publish this story. And you're following him as this happens, and it gets creepier and creepier. It is a short story, so I think it's pretty fast-paced, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was called Best New Horror. If you can get a hold of Best New Horror as a standalone story, or check out the book from your local library and read that one story, I thought it was really, really well done. By far my favorite thing that Joe Hill has written out of the little bit of him that I have actually read. And lastly, this is more of a bonus book because this isn't horror, but it's very fall, and so I want to include it here as a bonus. We have The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This is actually my mom's copy that I got her a couple of years ago. It's on my shelves. The copy that Victoria from What Victoria Read sent me is also still on my shelves. Thank you again, Victoria, for that. I've read it twice. I loved this book. It's a very slow burn. one of the earlier slow burn books that I read that helped me discover that I really like slow burn. But as slow as this book was, the first time I read it, I read most of it over a single night because I just didn't want to put it down. We are following a woman who works in her dad's rare bookshop, and she finds this set of stories written by an author, and it's 13 tales. It was originally called 13 Tales. I think there was only one copy with that title that was still in circulation because all of the other books had been pulled, but it was re-released as 12 Tales, and she starts to be curious about what is this 13th tale? Why did they change the title? Why did she not add in that other story? And eventually she is actually contacted by this author saying, if you want to write my life story, if you want to hear it from me, if you want to, come get my 13th tale, come out to my house, write it down, And so she goes to this woman's house. It's way out of the way, and we start to hear this woman's story slowly unfold, and it's just got this really creepy, kind of haunted vibe to it. There aren't ghosts in this, but it's a very haunting storyline. It's got the cozy fall vibes. You are sitting in this really big library that's super dark. The only light is coming from the fireplace. And you sit down with this author, and she just starts telling the story, and it really sets the mood. So this is the last book I'm going to recommend that follows the story of a writer. I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that you enjoyed this. I would love to hear more about horror books, about writers, so if you have any recommendations, please leave a comment down below if it's a book that I haven't talked about, because turns out that's a subgenre I really love, and I want to know more about it. I want to read more from it. Please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media, and I will see all of you tomorrow. Bye, friends.